Sometimes.
What does this mean? This is my video.
Oh, webinar is now streaming live. How's everyone doing this evening?
Well, Dawn.
You know, doing all right despite my mango peel allergic reaction. All right. Okay. All right. Hi, Chanet. Hi, Megan Sheehan Dean. And hi, Shay Marie Dunham. Thank you for direct in the Zoom experience. The last thing I'm gonna do before we get started is make sure I share Facebook on my page to capture more viewers. And then it'll be on and popping. Record. All right. So welcome to my special edition of my roundtable talk that I've been doing since last year. When I started running for Metro Council, people liked me bringing up different ideas in the community and different issues, and having amazing panelists like the ones I have tonight on. You know, and so I said, hey, let's keep doing it. And so I have been, I started back doing roundtable talks again this year in February as part of my culture and diversity initiative as Madam Vice President of the East Baton Rouge Parish School Board. If you want some more stuff and information about that, hit me up on my website, www.DawnChanetCollins.com. Hi, Ted Feinberg. Good people. There's all good people in there. And then you go to the Madam Vice President tab and you'll see the Culture and Diversity Initiative info there. This particular roundtable is part one of a special edition, The Truth About Public Education, part one. Where did the narrative of failing schools start? Where did it come from? It's a very important discussion to have. A lot of people really, especially in terms of politics, on movies, on TV, we see all the time, you know, folks showing corruption or showing all the action on council, on state level politics in Congress, and people just assume that school board politics is nothing. It's small potatoes. Does it even exist? Yes, it does. Look at the countless dollars spent on campaign contributions by folks who have a lot to win and gain from the public tax dollars spent in public ed. So with that being said, what I'm gonna do is introduce you all to my co-host, the awesome, illustrious Keith E. Benson. Ed.D, doctorate in education. I met this brother, and I'll let everybody introduce themselves. But I have to give him a special shout out and lift him up as my co-host because I met him online via a paper he wrote. And the headline says, "To the Black Education." The title is "To the Black Education Reform Establishment, Be Real with Who You Are and Whose Interests You Represent." And I just find that to be very refreshing to hear a brother lift up something so important. A lot of folks, especially here locally, and especially with a vote I made, sometimes things get clouded by race, and sometimes things are or oftentimes rather, things are bigger than race, and sometimes you have to call a spade a spade. And so Brother Benson is with Camden Education Association, and I'll let him introduce himself, and then I'll let the panelists introduce themselves.
So good evening, everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me pretty good. My name is Dr. Benson. I'm the president of the Camden Education Association in Camden, New Jersey. We're a public teachers association or union for representing about 1,100 members here in New Jersey. If anybody out there is not really familiar where Camden is at, it is directly east across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. So if you go on the map, you look at Philadelphia, look directly to your right. That city right there is Camden, New Jersey. That's where I live. That's where I work. And those are the educators I represent. I'm really happy to be here. Hopefully we're able to have a good discussion and learn from one another. So I'm looking forward to it, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Keith. All right, Ms. Nyman, can you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, my name's Tania Nyman. I got involved in education advocacy in 2012 when I joined with other parents to fight against the effort to create a breakaway school district here in southeastern portion of the parish, East Baton Rouge Parish. Before that, I'm born and raised in Louisiana, product of New Orleans public schools, and I had a graduate degree in creative writing. I was an instructor in the Department of English at LSU for 10 years. But in 2012, I was a homemaker and running after kids, and thought that it was going to be one legislative session to defeat that effort to create a breakaway school system. It went on for several years, and other parents and we created one community, one school district. When we were doing the organizing for that, our research, we learned about the similarities between the breakaway school system and breakaway schools, i.e. charter schools. And so we spent a lot of time trying to raise awareness about the issues and why both efforts were harmful to public education and to the community. I've also worked with Beyond Bricks and was on an action committee for the Dialogue on Race and served on my civic association. Most recently, I've run for office twice. In 2018, I ran for school board. In 2020, I ran for Metro Council. I did not win either seat, though I was pretty competitive, though. But I consider both campaigns a success because I wholeheartedly embrace Charlotta Bass's saying, win or lose, we win by raising the issues. And so I do think and hope that a lot of people learned from my campaigns about some of the issues, particularly related to education.
Thank you, Tanya. Sister Lampe, go ahead and grace us with your intro.
I was thinking about this. So I'm a retired now from association work. I was a union organizer for 30 years, really 35 years. And I sometimes tell people I don't know whether I was in witness protection or couldn't keep a job, but I've worked a lot of different places. So, and I started thinking about the fact that I was very lucky. I started out in Tennessee as a teacher, but I started there when the 1984 report came out about a nation at risk. And so I was there for the beginning of the career ladder program that Lamar Alexander introduced. Then I went on staff and went to Texas and fought Ross Perot, actually debated him on television over testing of teachers, which they insisted every teacher in Texas be tested. Then I went to Kentucky and landed there for the 1990 Reform Act, where they threw out of the laws about schools there and came up with the funding formula, school-based decision-making, everything else in the whole wide world that you've ever heard about in testing. And then I went to Indianapolis and became chief negotiator for the Indianapolis Education Association, which had just lost its bargaining rights. It was the only school district in Indiana that couldn't bargain. They got school-based decision-making, so we went after that to try to change things. And then I've been in South Carolina, North Carolina, and then I landed in Louisiana. So that's me. A lot of, and I taught for 13 years.
Thank you so much. And last but absolutely not least, Sister Maria Harmon.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Harmon. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of Step Up Louisiana. I did a lot of popping around throughout Louisiana myself. I'm originally from Lake Charles, so all of my developmental years are there. And I went to college at Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I got my bachelor's and my master's degrees from Southern University. And that's where I actually started organizing. It's where I met Dawn and a lot of other great community leaders that helped me get to where I'm at today. And I co-founded Step Up Louisiana in New Orleans when I moved there for another job opportunity to organize after I graduated from Southern with my master's. So I have a pretty well-rounded perspective of definitely South Louisiana across the I-10 corridor, just personal and professional experiences. But it's very interesting to see how all of these local school districts along this the parish lines across this major interstate operate. I'll say that, to say the least.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
All right, so we want to first start off by going into something pretty basic that people tend not to think about, especially as it relates to education. And that's about power and discussing the way power operates, recognizing game for what it is. It's important that people really start to think beyond the buzzwords that people from both political parties, from all social and economic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, excuse me, beyond the Black Power fist or the solidarity fist, if we're talking about union, because it's easy to raise a fist and shout and banter a couple of talking points that turn people on and catch people. But we as voters, and I am an elected official, but I also recognize I have to pay attention to, as I listen to my colleagues on the board, as I interact with other elected officials and make my own decisions, we have to be critical thinkers ourselves. We have to hold ourselves accountable. Like, yes, hold me accountable as a school board member, but we must also hold ourselves accountable instead of blindly accepting the terms as terms are defined. For example, when people say failing schools, or when people say good schools even, right? First ask who defined the terms and why. When you question the terms, you see the narrative more clearly because you don't take for granted that people actually mean what they say. The narrative is terms, those who crafted the narrative, and its impact will be illustrated more as we move through this 3-part series. Today is where did the narrative of failing schools come from? We have another one coming up on the 21st in 2 weeks. That'll be part 2, who crafted the narrative? And then part 3 is the impact on community. So we hope that you'll join us for each one. If you really enjoyed this one, share about the next 2 with others. What I'm gonna do right now is for those that are in have joined us in Zoom, I'm gonna share a little guide. It's a little 3-page guide, PDF, where you can see kind of where we coming from. We got together, we brainstormed ideas about the important topics to touch. And then we also know that as we dialogue and get excited about mentioning this, that, and the third, we wanna make sure you walk away with just the basic understanding to have in your hand. Because it's a lot to unpack. And it's a lot to digest, especially for those who've not necessarily digested this information. So I've shared that with you. I also want to just first mention, also under the how power works, again, beyond the fist, whether it's solidarity or Black power, you had to ask that question, who wears the mask? It's not enough to follow the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes the loudest voice functions as a mask for those defining the terms and profiting off taxpayers' dollars under the guise of equity for children of color and those who are impoverished. Racism, right now in the age of Trump, we see heightened racism, or we're able to recognize heightened racism. and racial tension and even gender tension and bias. But what we are recognizing right now, it never went away. And I think a lot of people, if not most people, realize that. A lot of people realize things have been more done in code or again, done behind the mask of others. So this is why it's very imperative for us as community folk to follow the money at all times, no matter who receives it, no matter what a person is saying. So then what we're going to do is move into a chronological or excuse me, I'm tongue tied. What we're going to do now is run through a timeline and how the narrative started and how it was developed. And so I want to lean on Brother Benson. He had made a comment and wrote a note about social policy and education as a matter of social policy. And for our viewers, can you elaborate on that, Dr. Benson?
Yeah, so typically, the way I understand education policy, the way things get passed has a lot to do with larger goals outside of specifically, I focus on specifically and only on urban public education. There's been a lot of narrative going around since 2000 in improving sort of failing schools for urban youth, like Black and brown kids. When the reality is it has very little to do with improving educational outcomes for this constituency at all, but a lot to do with corporations or private interests getting access to roughly, at the time, I think the quote was around the late 90s, 600, and it certainly went up from there, $600 billion annually in education budget money that used to be off limits to private interests. So how do you get access to that? Well, you have to create a good narrative, you have to create a good story. And what constituency has least amount of political power or political representation than urban folk and urban students? So a narrative is created about poor or failing urban schools that a lot of people are unfamiliar with, is easily understood with simply just using test scores as a metric. And a lot of people, and easy for folks to simply just get behind. So it's about access to this huge pot of money. And also, which was what my dissertation was on, is actually how education reform sort of intersects with urban redevelopment, which puts a lot of urban areas and folks who live in low income environments, because that's the place that's affordable, it puts them in really tenuous situations that really needs to be paid a lot more attention to. And folks really need to have their antennas up if they're in neighborhoods where charter schools, not corporate charter schools, but charter schools start popping up in their neighborhood. Pay attention to your rental rates and taxes around you, because you might be in danger of being pushed out your neighborhood.
Thanks for sharing that. So we're going to pop it off with Nation at Risk.
Okay.
All right, and so Ms. Lampe and Brother Benson,
Okay.
if you all could share, and Mr. Benson as my co-host, if you could help me tease out certain points and lift up certain points that are made that we need to really make sure folks catch. That'll be so helpful.
Okay. So I've been teaching a lot. I've been teaching 13 years when A Nation at Risk was published. And as I said, I was in Tennessee, and Lamar Alexander, who was governor at the time, decided to take I guess you would call it a field trip with power brokers across Tennessee. And he started talking about this nation at risk and what was wrong with public schools. At the same time, there were meetings going on in Nashville, Tennessee. Some of the folks were meeting at Vanderbilt University, which has a very famous college of education, Peabody. And these were the Gold Dust twins out of Colorado, the Amway folks, who I understand DeVos is in bed with and has been part of it. And those folks came together, and when they realized, as Dr. Benson said, the billions of dollars that are out there in public education money, they wanted to get their hands on that money. They wanted to start coming up with ideas about how were they going to take charge and get that money. So they had to plant the seeds, though, and say that public schools were failing and that all we needed to do is start looking around. And all of a sudden, we had basic skills testing going on in Tennessee, and we had testing going on here and testing going on there. But that was one of the seeds that was planted. Was a nation at risk, and it was about money, and it was about putting public money into private hands.
So,
Okay.
yeah, so I sort of piggyback. I'm sorry, folks, apologize out there. I got some notes regarding these things. So I want to sort of go through them to sort of add some background. A lot of folks have really had to understand that how big a nation at risk as a report was in terms of United States education policy. And the timing of it is really, really, really important. So nation at risk is sort of like the precursor of No Child Left Behind, and certainly before No Race to the Top, which all was disastrous. So nation at risk was generated back in 1983. The reason why that is important during the Reagan administration, the reason why that timing is important is because Reagan was in the midst of a recession. So there was massive unemployment, massive inflation, and the public at large were sort of at their wits' end as to what was going on around them economically. During that time, Nation at Risk comes out. And what the Nation at Risk report enabled Reagan to do was point to an education system as the problem to all these economic situations that were going on. In fact, one, the findings of Nation at Risk that our schools were terrible was a lie, that was a myth, right? But it was convenient because it provided our schools to be a sort of whipping boy and something that Reagan could hide behind as the reason why our nation was going through tough economic times. The thing about Nation at Risk that was really interesting is that here, I think for the very first time, education is being connected to economic well-being of an entire nation and national security. So they said the fact our schools are failing presents our nation as a whole, it becomes a national security threat, which was convenient at that time because if you remember, we're still in the Cold War in the 1980s with the Soviet Union, and folks are afraid of of Russia, and you still see some of that really right now. And I actually, sorry, as an aside for proof, if you look at Rocky movies when he's fighting that guy Ivan Drago in the USSR, there's lots of issues with the United States going on with Russia at the time, or Soviet Union at the time. So it's very easy for folks to sort of understand. All right, so that being said, Nation at Risk was very highly influential. And in fact, it was one of the most influential educational happenings since Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 and the Soviet launching of Sputnik in 1957. And then close to 30 years later, you have Nation at Risk in 1983, which is highly, highly influential. And as what Sister Gretchen referenced, it was so influential, you had a brood of quote unquote education governors, primarily in the South, adopting the belief and the stance of Nation at Risk, which called for more testing, longer school days, standardization of curriculum. And those are the sort of main things, all right? Let me see, just going over these notes. So for the record, I wanted to say this. For folks to understand, my bias, because it's important to understand people's biases who are presenting to you. I am a socialist, which means I am not a believer in capitalism and the values that we typically espouse in this country. What I recognize is that education and subsequent research will bear this out, is not necessarily a cure for the ills of capitalism, which means, and this is very, very true in the 1980s, is that if the goal of capitalists is to maximize profit, which is to find the cheapest labor possible, having more education in the United States doesn't necessarily solve that, because what would happen is, and which would happen in the 1980s, which I'll get back to Nation at Risk, is that folks are becoming more and more educated. But what happens is, as companies begin to offshore and outsource, they're simply finding the cheapest labor force. So what you went to school for, cool. Companies are now finding other countries to do it for way cheaper, even though you are more educated. So going back to Nation at Risk, they were saying that schools need to rapidly change because of the rapidly computerized and technological age that was burgeoning. So we need to have our schools be more vigorous and better, and simply just focus not on these other electives like the arts and sciences, the arts, but more on sort of math, literacy, and the very, very real basics. The reality is that technological age, or the need for more educated vis-a-vis or through testing students in the United States, was all a myth. Case in point, the United States puts out more STEM graduates, hundreds of thousands more STEM graduates every year than jobs that are available. But going back to Nation at Risk, I'm sorry, it's really important. You can't really understand you can't really understand the magnitude of No Child Left Behind unless you understand that Nation at Risk was its precursor and was simply just a bunch of recommendations, but the narrative was created that our schools are failing and needed radical change. Sorry, I'm done.
No, go back to the STEM graduates and how we graduate more STEM, but do we not use a shortage as an excuse of STEM graduates and it's as an excuse to do H1N1? No, that's
V1, H1B1, I think. Visas.
Not N1, not the bird.
Well, at one point, I want to weigh in on this too. Well, you want to get the. So I don't think anything I'm going to say is going to contradict the narrative per se, but in my lens is money and power will always seek to maintain money and power, and they'll create a narrative to justify that. And so I actually think that it didn't it seems like a subtle difference, but that Nation at Risk didn't allow for those business opportunities to suddenly see. It was created, right? And I think it actually starts back with Brown versus Board, when the money and power recognized that Jim Crow, its days were numbered, and they weren't going to be able to rely on those laws anymore to have a subjugated population to exploit. And so then you see Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist, publishing that paper in 1955 about government schools, which are the description of the current corporate charter model. It is publicly funded schools that are privately governed. And that is what he started calling for in 1955, in anticipation of the fact that they weren't going to be able to maintain those Jim Crow laws. And what you see following the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act is the way in which business interests started formulating this narrative to get us back to what is effectively Jim Crow era style governance structure, so that they can continue to siphon the profits out of the urban communities and profit from them. And so it's just that subtle little shift in terms of, yeah, it wasn't like Nation at Risk woke them up. They designed Nation at Risk. They wrote and published Nation at Risk to justify that evolution to get us back to that governance structure.
Okay, but let's go back all the way. I think Don spoke about the Moynihan report back in the 60s.
Yes.
So you have to go also back that what happened was after Brown versus Board of Education, that we were supposed to integrate our schools. So having lived next to Prince Edward County, Virginia at the time, Virginia decided, because Friedman was a good friend of the president of the University of Virginia, that they were not going to have public schools. So literally, the General Assembly in Virginia said, no more public schools. And the public did sort of rise about that, but Prince Edward managed to close their public schools. They actually put chains on the doors. Wow. And unless you could afford to go to Prince Edward Academy, then you had to find another way to be educated. And that's when we had folks coming down from the north and teaching children in the basement of churches and other public places where they could educate them. But think also about the fact that we have the first passage of the Elementary Secondary Education Act. And that is the first time federal money in large amounts, right, go into school systems with two things in mind. Supposedly Head Start, right? Which was supposed to work with little kids and get them ready to go to school. And then we had money coming in for reading at first. We had Title I reading programs. And so if we were going to have Title I reading, then when are we going to get the silver bullet necessary to make sure those kids are going to be able to read? We had to go out and buy things, right, to put in our schools. And that's the beginning of like the Pearson model and all of that. So yeah, so it's been there all along.
Okay, now you had another point, or because I wanted to go back to two things Keith mentioned. One, he mentioned his bias as a socialist. I'm economically agnostic because my viewpoint is if human beings with the wrong heart are operating any system, I don't disagree with his viewpoint. I'm saying, and I'm lifting that up to say what we are saying is true regardless of what economic system you prefer or believe in, or how you feel about capitalism, although it could be argued, as I'm sure Brother Keith would love to have a discussion later on about how capitalism helps fuel what we're discussing is a problem or takes advantage much more easily of the problem.
We'd have to get into the myriad of ways in which American capitalism doesn't even subscribe to Adam Smith's notion of capitalism. And so, good Lord, we don't have time for that tonight, do we?
We talk about defining the terms, right?
Right.
Adam Smith's capitalism is it Milton Friedman's capitalism or whatever? Right. Yeah. So
and just think about Princeton, New Jersey, where ETS was, because ETS through money became the guardians of who entered different professions. Could you pass the LSAT to go to school to be an attorney?
But explain to people who ETS is, and then I want to come back to because I ended up cutting off Brother Keith on the point about STEM graduates and H-1B1 visas. And so if you want to hit on that, Keith, after she explains ETS, what ETS is for those that are not aware.
Okay, so Educational Testing Service sitting in Princeton, New Jersey, has forever given the SAT. Which supposedly, if you were going to go to some highbrow school, the Ivy Leagues in particular, you had to take the SAT. And they became the gatekeeper of those of that. And then they became the gatekeeper of, are you going to law school? Are you going to medical school? Are you passing this? Are you passing that? And literally, they had all the exams out there, and you had to pay bunches of money to take them. And they became the gatekeeper of who or who not could go to school or get into a profession. And it was about money.
So I'm gonna come back to ETS, the SAT, and why Nation at Risk was a lie after Keith gets a chance to respond to us having the most STEM graduates in the US, but we still have to support others.
So that's something that's really very easily understood intuitively by folks. That there's that in this information age, and we're going in sort of contemporary times now, but it started back in the late 80s. That as things become more computerized and more revolved around technology, that our schooling system had to sort of reflect that. But when the reality is, there never was a Gene Indian pointing this out back in the late 90s. Is that the STEM shortage that was much talked about in the late 80s never was. And there's research out there contemporary, like going on right now, that suggests that our universities put out way more science, technology, engineering, and math graduates than there are jobs available. So if you sort of rewind that back to Nation at Risk, is that they're calling for something as a ruse to say that there's a problem to have access to more money, which would have been off limits before. The reason why the economy was struggling is not because our public school system is not putting out enough STEM graduates, or that our kids are not ready for the changing economy. It's because there are not enough jobs to pay them for the folks who are educating in that space. But a lot of folks don't, like you said, don't ask those sort of critical thought, or don't have the sort of critical thoughts, or ask really tough questions, or secondary questions, or follow-up questions. They adopt primarily what is that they're told. And again, Nation at Risk was highly influential. And one thing I want to actually talk about before we actually sort of move forward into the other subsequent education policies, is one thing I found unique about Nation at Risk is at that time, it didn't seem to really differentiate specifically failing for only urban schools. They talked about the American school system as a whole was failing. We don't really get to the specific urban schools failure until roughly 20 years later with No Child Left Behind. But I think there's a really interesting distinction between where No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top got versus where Nation at Risk started.
So, but you have to sort of, I want to talk for a minute about the whole financial equity question about how we fund schools, because that had a great impact in terms of all of a sudden, after we had Nation and Risk in 1989, when we finally came down with the Rose decision out of Kentucky, which talked about the fact that the whole way they were doing schools there was really unconstitutional. So in 1990, they had to come up with all kinds of new laws, but they came up with a new funding formula, which was a student-based formula, which was different from foundations and how we were, the minimum foundation program was how we were funding schools before. Then we came up with per pupil funding, and this was done by Augenblick and Myers out of Denver, Colorado at the time. They actually wrote what's known as the SIG formula, and it was a very simple formula. But what made the difference is out of that decision came financial stuff, came school-based decision making, which is really sort of like community schools. And it's the reason that Kentucky does not have a charter school in it, because it allowed for parent councils with representatives of teachers and ESPs. And if you were at a high school, you had students on it. And it gave a lot of power to the school itself to make decisions about curriculum and discipline and who would be the principal and who was hired into the school. And they got the money and they made decisions about how money would be spent in their school. So after it passed, and all of that came into being, we also got an accountability question, which is where the first testing, big kind, was called CURIS, the Kentucky Instructional Results Information System, which started going after schools and saying, you've got to make this much progress. And if you don't make this much progress, then we're going to say that you are not a good school. And this not only affected the schools like in Louisville, which is the urban area, it also affected the schools in Eastern Kentucky, which are the poverty areas of that state, where you have a lot of poor Appalachian folks up there. And so we had all this money and all of that stuff rolling around there. And all of a sudden, every expert in the whole country is coming to Kentucky with their little package of snake oil that they're going to sell to everybody so that you can be successful. And the testing companies were coming out of the woodwork. How are we going to find the testing and get it done? I'm sorry.
No, and I want to come back to that. A couple of points you made when you shared the Kentucky model, when we get to talking more about the standardization and the
Mhm.
accountability system.
Curriculum and all of that. Mhm.
Yeah. I want to lift up what Gretchen mentioned about ETS. Gretchen, so you said ETS was the gatekeeper of what?
Of the professions. Think about it.
Okay.
If to go to school, I had to have a certain score on the SAT.
Uh-huh.
And if we know that standardized testing has bias to it, and we've known for years that standardized testing has bias to it. It's biased against children of poverty, and it's biased against children of color.
Yes.
Because there's not a common vocabulary that runs through all of us. And if I want to call a sofa or a divan or a couch, and all three words can be used interchangeably, but I put on a test that it's a divan, and that's not common in the area where I live, I'm not going to know what it is.
So Gretchen.
And so we play games with kids and students and young adults all the time to gatekeep who gets access
Okay.
to what might be the American dream.
Okay. So y'all keep that in mind. I'm referring to an article on Education Week by Mark Tucker from May 2nd, 2018. A nation at risk was fake news. That's what Mark said. All right.
Yes.
That's what a lot of people said, have learned. In fact, Mark makes a lot of references to an NPR article who happens to be funded by Walton Foundation. So if they manage to say the same thing, then baby, it must be a little truth to it. All right. So Mark made a point of pulling out what the lab was all about. So first he points out that the NPR article quoted one of the writers of Nation at Risk, who said that they never set out to undertake an objective inquiry into the state of the nation's schools. They only sought to produce a document that reinforced the narrative that schools are failing. Okay. How do we know that the narrative is improper? Based on their own methodology. So, and I'll quote from the article, much of the famous claim that this country would have gone to war if a foreign country had inflicted such a decline in student performance. That was the famous line. If another country had done this to us, we'd be at war right now. Okay. It's in terms of student performance, rested on long-term decline in performance on the ACT. Who was the ACT for? It was for more affluent folks, right?
Now, SAT was more affluent. American college testing was most state schools used ACT.
All right, so SAT was started to be a gatekeeper to elite universities. They wanted,
yeah, the Ivy League in particular.
So it's biased in that regard. Though the data was real, the population taking the test had gone from a small elite group. Because you have to remember, by 1983, there are more people who were impoverished and first-time high school graduates going to college. There are more people of color. There are more people of diverse socioeconomic standards. So when you use the SAT and you're looking at scores from 1960 to 1983, at the same time that more people from diverse backgrounds start to take a skewed test, at that same time, the test was declining. It showed So what they really showed was not so, and they refused, they omitted that information. When they shared a 50-point decline in the SAT scores and rang the alarm to say, oh my God, our students are getting dumber. And if another nation had come here and done the same thing, they knew they were lying. They knew they were being misleading. But most people, the average person, okay, so when I took stat, when I was getting my master's degree, one professor, and it's a common saying, but it was the first time I paid attention. He said, you know, statistics, lies, and more damn lies. Is the way you walk through. So these people were well aware that there were a whole lot more folks from diverse socioeconomics taking the SAT scores, taking the SAT test. The fact that the scores started dipping reflects the bias in the damn test, not that the people were getting more stupid. Okay.
Dawn, I'm waiting for you to transfer over to John White's use of the ACT, right?
We're going to get there.
Yeah.
Put a pin in that. We're going to get there because we still have to go through the chronology. Right, Brother Benson, looking at your notes, is there anything else we need to touch on on Nation at Risk?
No, I think y'all listening. I think y'all did a pretty darn good job of that, man.
All right.
Wait, I want to touch on one other thing.
Okay.
Besides the fact that it was talking about students, it also had a direct effect on the teaching profession.
All right.
When you start talking about career ladders, or you start talking about taking tests to judge a school, you start having a direct effect upon the profession also. So if you're in a failing school, not only do your kids feel bad, but everybody in the school is getting
trash.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I want to whisper. I'm glad you mentioned that. But this is one thing I think it's really important to differentiate is that Nation at Risk was essentially a set of recommendations, was very influential, a set of recommendations. It was not law, but its influence was there. The laws don't come into effect until, boom, No Child Left Behind. So as Gretchen was referencing, that's very important, but it comes much more important after 2000 because now there really is law and policy attached to that. But I think that's a really important distinction to make between these two policies. I mean, these two sets of these bodies of education work.
Right. No, they had to lay the groundwork for the narrative to get those laws passed. And that's where it's,
Exactly. I would really like to expound on my own lived experience of what I've seen as a child, because I graduated from 8th grade in spring of 2002. And that's when the No Child Left Behind era really kicked off around that time, where my parents actually chose to send me to parochial school for high school. So I actually seen 13 and 14-year-olds stressed out because they were going to public school about how they did on the LEAP test. I had close friends of mine who were going to grade 8.5, not 9th grade, because of how they did on the test. And to me, it was like, wow, like this is where we're at. And then I started to see how my parents started to put pressure on me in 9th grade to like really be determined and intentional about the diploma I get when I graduated from high school and preparing me for the ACT. I took the ACT about 6 times. To make sure I got a certain score so I could get tops to go to college at Southern. I wanted to get out of Lake Charles. And, I think about how much money my parents had put forward, the testing prep classes, like all of this testing and stuff. And I remember being in grade school thinking to myself, my big cousins didn't really go through this. So why is this happening? Right. And now as an adult, I've seen the bigger scheme of things. It's just really mind blowing because I am a child of No Child Left Behind here. Okay. The millennials of today, and our children are now going through this crazy system of testing and one thing my mom always told me, they're raising the ACT score because they see too many Black kids graduating from high school, going to college and getting a degree and getting jobs. Let's really be real about what it means when we see standardized testing. I even took the LSAT a few times myself and took prep classes didn't go to law school, but I spent a lot of money on that too. So standardized testing has been like in my life since a child. I'm 32 years old now. So, you know, this is just beyond me. When I see it just perpetually continuing, I said to myself, Texas Instruments, they got big bank. Because that was one of the big companies that you see that are providing the calculators, the testing booklets, the test itself, Kaplan, like Gretchen mentioned, Ms. Lampe, ETS. These are big companies, and I really see it as a mode of privatization as well, because it invokes so many things, even policy.
Okay. If I can, and I will come back to you, Tanya. If I could lift up two things that Maria mentioned. Her family, like many families, avoid the testing and over testing of our children simply by, okay, you know what? Tired of this, tired of my child stressing out, tired of my child maybe having to take the test several times because it's like, and they just go into a private or parochial and avoid it altogether, right? The other thing I think is important to lift up and bring attention to is remember the time frame. Not only was it an economic recession, we were coming out of the civil rights movement. You had young brothers like Huey P. Newton. You had brothers like Fred Hampton. When I watched Judas and the Black Messiah, and yeah, I had heard of Fred Hampton and heard speeches before, but as they say sometimes, he was so articulate. You know, like how scary is that somebody who was not even or had just become legal to drink alcohol by today's legal standards. He was powerful enough to gain the attention and smart enough to gain the attention of folks like the FBI and everybody else. And they organized not only the Black Panthers and other activists, organized not just in the US, they had impact across the globe. Do you really want more Fred Hamptons? Do you really want more Huey P. Newtons? Is it not? Is it incidental or is it a direct correlation that just a decade later, as the civil rights movement is starting to phase, calm down, if you will, that something like Nation at Risk comes out to say that something is wrong that really wasn't wrong. And I'll make this one more point, and Tanya, I hope I didn't not steal your thunder. I hope okay, good. All right. So one other thing that is important to note is not only did they knowingly mislead people about what the SAT scores meant, there was also a report done by the U.S. Department of Education, not education, the U.S. Department of Energy. And the U.S. Department of Energy also studied 7 years after the Nation at Risk report came out. They also studied various tests and various academic indicators. And the reason that the Department of Energy had done that was because they were trying to forecast and make economic projections so they could do whatever it is that they do at the U.S. Department of Energy. And what they found actually no evidence to support the panel's contention of precipitous broad decline in student performance. In fact, there was also other research that showed that, yes, at the beginning of the 1960s, there was a steep decline, but by the end of the 60s, going into the 70s, that cohort of students that entered into school in the late 60s had made great gains. So when Nation at Risk put out their report, there was a whole lot of quote unquote improvement and leveling of the playing field to some extent that had already taken place. But they put the report out as if everything was a huge disaster. To me, that's extremely important that you pay attention to the terms and the narrative, because, for example, in East Baton Rouge, and I'm gonna stop with this point, everybody wants to say we trash East Baton Rouge Parish school system. The only reason why they want to say we trash is because we are the second largest school system and stand to be a huge profit to other people. We are a C letter grade district, if you want to do letter grades, okay? We gonna get into the accountability and letter grades in part 2, okay? Because it's too much for this. But East Baton Rouge, by reform movement standards, is C. It's an average. And people might want to say magnet school this, magnet school that. Okay, but 80-something%, 85% or so of our school system is free and reduced lunch. So poor babies are going to those magnet programs as well. Okay. That being said, how are we an obscene failure as a school system? And how can it be said that we are in crisis and we need a savior from out of the state somewhere that's going to come and work a miracle in Baton Rouge because the house is on fire, it's a 3-alarm fire? How are we going to say that when by virtue of their own standards, we are a success? Because we should be an F.
This is where I do get frustrated. Here's why I get frustrated. Because that accountability system is designed to set East Baton Rouge Parish School System up for privatization. There is no winning that game. And every argument the business community makes to compel you to try to win that game is illogical. And progressives want to get their hands, they get all, how stupid they must be. Can't they see how illogical their arguments are? They're not stupid, they're misleading. They have an objective. They want to see the school system privatized. They will say any inane argument that suits their needs until they achieve that objective. And so, that's the first thing that we sort of discovered. That was my eye opening, right? Because of course, the breakaway school system, that was Bodie White's argument for why they needed a Southeast breakaway school system, because, East Baton Rouge Parish school system was failing, and all the parents are sitting around going, what do you mean? Yes, this school system has its challenges. It has issues. We're not perfect. But at that point in time, especially, we were on a trajectory of improving. We had finally gotten out from the DSEG order. And, there was a lot of public interest and goodwill for the public schools. And I can tell you, I chose not to go back to New Orleans because of what they did to New Orleans following Katrina. And I saw that, all right, EBR has its problems, but we're improving and it's going to continue to get better. Look at all the people that went in. And then immediately you see Bodie White starting with, well, it's a failing school system. What was interesting is that we started looking, well, how can they declare this school system a failure when we've got all these award-winning schools? Yes, we've got some struggling schools. And you compared it to the A school districts, and they had none of the same accolades. And they also had none of the poverty. And so it was immediately eye-opening. That accountability system is set up, and it's not even set up to encourage breakaway school systems. It's set up to encourage the proliferation of out-of-state charter schools. And what was heartbreaking was you could also see the fact that, like, Bodie White kind of could see the handwriting on the wall. The whole way the system was set up is if they didn't break away, their school system, they would be taken over too, because of course, when 80% of the schools were declared failing, they could take the whole district over regardless. And so they were trying to get out before Baton Rouge Area Chamber and Baton Rouge Area Foundation had the legal argument to take over our entire parish. And so, that's what's so frustrating, is that once you recognize the logic behind these rules that we know are illogical, well, the logic doesn't have anything to do with they're saying they do, So, and that was my aside. I was going to talk about standardized testing from my childhood too, and watching the way in which, yet again, do you want me to go back to that, or should we just stay on this?
Well, we do need to move forward with No Child Left Behind.
Okay. Well, that's the testing, right? So maybe this will be a little segue, because Maria talked about the way in which testing affected her education. And remember my lens, watching the way in which, right, once something starts getting funded, the money starts trying to figure out how they're going to use it to their own ends. Well, I think, when I was taking a CTBS test back in the 70s, right, testing days were actually a little fun because it was only the only thing you had to do to prepare, there was no pressure, was learning how to bubble in the circles. And then you took a test for a couple of hours, and then we had an extended recess, and we kind of had a fluff day in the afternoon. And so it was no pressure for us. And it was, I think it was implemented. The original argument was to say, we need to make sure that schools, because remember, they weren't adequately funding schools across neighborhoods because our neighborhoods were so segregated. And so they wanted to make sure that schools were receiving the adequate funding. And so that was the original testing, right? But you can see that getting co-opted in the 90s, so that instead of what schools need to be given more resources so that children can achieve their full potential, it became, you're a failing school, we need to shut you down. And so it's really heartbreaking to watch that.
Shut you down and do what, Tanya? Not just shut you down, but shut you down and place a private school, a charter school.
You know, my little thing of saying now, during Jim Crow, parents had to pass the test to be able to elect their school board members. Now the kids have to pass the test. And when the kids fail the test, the parents lose the ability to elect their school board members. That's how they've gotten us back to Jim Crow.
And we'll dig more into the democratization of public ed and give more details on that as we move forward for anyone who's watching and not familiar with some of the background on that. So then, all right, so 1983-ish was Nation Service, NAR, okay? And so then here we come to 2001 with President George Bush. And remember that, I don't know if Gretchen mentioned it here while she was speaking, but there were education governors. Who are the three education governors, Gretchen? The one
So we had different education governors. We had Alexander and even Clinton in Arkansas did some stuff, but then you had Jim Hunt here in North Carolina, who was actually funding schools and had done a lot of work with early childhood and that kind of thing. And so you had some moving forward and some. I was in Texas and it just was a mess. I mean, there's not anything you could even, it was so big and so, and I was just looking to see, I thought I was right. Perot, who was down in Texas, not only was he running for governor, he ran EDS, which was data systems.
Okay.
And Marie mentioned Texas Instruments. So you had all these people who would like to through all of that.
So
but
then
the testing came.
I wasn't intending to put you in the hot seat to elaborate. I just wanted to put you in the hot seat with some names.
But just think about it. You were transitioning out of Bill Clinton.
Yes.
Into George Bush.
Yes.
Both Bush had been the governor in Texas. Clinton
Yes.
had been governor in Arkansas.
Yes.
And so they were coming together. And I was I happened to go to Stanford during that time period with the Indianapolis people and happened to work with Linda Darling Hammond for just a little bit. And she talked about the fact that, Kennedy was dying at that point. Well, a little bit after that. So you had No Child Left Behind. And then you were going to have a little while later when Obama came in, they needed to redo the act. But by the time they redid it, Kennedy, who had been on the 2000 Act, was dying. And even though they were recognizing some of the problems that occurred, they didn't have the leaders that they needed maybe to do more. All it did was just get worse, especially when they added on that stupid race to the top.
Okay, so let's dig deep then and go into No Child Left Behind. So 2001, it called for using standardized tests in math, literacy, and later sciences as the indicator of school and student success with rewards and punishment. Bush, with huge support of the House and Senate, brought No Child Left Behind to push back against, and I'll let Brother Keith take this over. This is how he phrased it, and I thought it was real well put. The soft bigotry of low expectations in education. Brother Keith, you want to take over going into No Child Left Behind and some details?
Yeah, so No Child Left Behind on the federal level was a sort of a federal version of what George Bush had in place in Texas prior to. And George, that soft bigotry of soft bigotry of low expectation was a George Bush quote as justification for why we need No Child Left Behind. The thing that's interesting about No Child Left Behind and deeply problematic, but intentional, was that you're defining now schools being successful or failing based off of singularly test scores, which did not exist prior to. Now, as was referenced before, I think Tania mentioned it, prior to when you had standardized tests, like I grew up in New Jersey, we had the Iowa test and the early warning test. You did not have to pass that exam. So what I did was there's something called, we were joking, called abracadabra, where I went A, B, A, cadabra all the way down till the end that the test was over with no consequences, right? No Child Left Behind changed those things and made and put schools, educators on the hook for how students perform on a standardized test that their teachers had no hand in crafting, right? So Pearson got rich, Hardcore Brace, Jonovich, these testing companies, these textbook, curriculum designers, they got rich because these tests were designed around these curriculum, which was new. All right. I also want to stress is that the tests were in given subjects like literacy, math, and again later on the sciences. So what they did was, particularly in urban areas where, as was referenced before, there's not a common vocabulary, and the most common indicator of how somebody will perform on a standardized test is their familial income. No Child Left Behind targeted urban, low income and urban areas for the consequences, because somebody can predict exactly how this constituency will perform on their test simply based off of their zip code. So you start hearing things about saying, a zip code should determine, how successful you are, but that's BS. Because when you define failing schools and failing teachers and so forth by test scores, you're already choosing who's going to win and who's going to lose. But what that did in terms of curriculum and what for these students' work days, specifically I could reference in New Jersey, what happened was, and I think it may have happened in other places across the country, is that a lot of these urban schools got a double dose of literacy and a double dose of math at the expense of the arts. So way less arts classes, way less music classes, way less non-curricular elective classes that other municipalities or other districts were able to get. More affluent districts students were able to have access to. So man, what is that? Your kids' interest, their creativity, and things like that. So what you're doing, you're punishing already the vulnerable. And again, that was not an accident. So what that does, that force schools to pay more attention to these strict, rigid, curricular or testing subjects, and sacrificing the more creative aspects of our children's development.
And then let me also lift up, people underestimate the significance of little to no music and little to no arts in their curriculum.
And that was a real problem, because like if you went into middle schools, all of a sudden, if you weren't doing well at math, you got hit with, I get a regular math, and then I get with a math, tutor kind of thing. Or if I didn't do well in reading, that's what happened to me. So the things that kids normally would have come to school for, maybe they liked art or they liked music or any of that, they were denied the opportunity to be able to participate in those things that would have given them a reason to be there. And that was just horrible. And
Also,
hold on, Dora, give me one quick second. And one thing I forgot to mention is the fact that your school's failing to meet AYP came with consequences.
Right.
Like takeover or
Yes.
wholesale firing or firing of staff or
Yes.
turnover of staff losing their certification. So that means you could have been a teacher doing your job for decades, but because by design and by targeting, your students did not predictably meet these numerical guidelines, you risk losing your job. And that never
Yeah.
just, the consequence of that was that you saw the sort of cheating scandals take place in Atlanta and other parts across the country. What do you expect to have happen?
And think about the transportation thing. Remember, they put in that whole thing about, oh, well, if your school's not succeeding, then we're going to notify the parents and transport them someplace else. It just got to be this nightmare that was going on especially in an urban school system. It was
Dawn, and then Dawn,
horrible.
are you going to talk about the color of law and the way in which the banking and housing gets tied into one of your future?
It does. And we can mention it briefly, but we want the people to come back for the other two parts. What I want to make sure I lift it up. People underestimate the significance of the creative electives being taken out of your regular curriculum. There's this guy who wrote a book called The Originals, Adam Grant, and he has a table in an illustration in his book. But he's an economist, and so he looks at social economy, if you will. I'm paraphrasing, but he looks at social dynamics of economics, etc. So one thing he looked at in this chart illustrated was that art directly influences how well you do in math and science. A lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people only think art.
I have to say, I beg to differ. I think the moneyed interest understand that all too well. So they know that by taking it out.
Now, when I say a lot of people, I'm interjecting the general public because most people will agree. You ask any mama if her baby is doing bad in math and reading, and she wants her baby to pass this test, not understanding it as bias in the first place. Okay, but this is your ticket to get what you need in this education system. You ask any mama or daddy, do you want to double block him for math and reading so he can do better on the math and reading tests? They're gonna say yes. They need more math and reading, not understanding the direct correlation between music and the arts and theater and how you perform in math and science. He even researched Nobel Prize winning scientists by type of art interest. If you play music, your chances of being a Nobel Prize winning scientist was like 2 or 3. And I'm just paraphrasing because I don't have it directly in front of me. I wish I had. I'll bring it and I'll share as an aside in the next in one of the next parts. On up to, if you do performing arts, it's like 10, 15 times higher chance that you who already enjoy math and science will be so good that you would be a Nobel winning scientist. So it's important. It's extremely important for people to understand how significant it is that math and science have been pulled. So in the SEL component, SEL being social emotional learning, like all of that is important. We have, by virtue of all this standardization, dehumanized the education experience. Somebody else
about
something. Go ahead, Gretchen.
We know that music through patterns, that if you're a really good musician, you're probably going to be a good mathematician because you're going to see the patterns that exist. So that's.
Yeah, well, Dawn, what you're also recognizing is that they've internalized the myth of the meritocracy, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's it. That, oh no, if my child works really hard and gets a good degree, and they'll get out and be very financially successful, which I always like to use myself as an example of how that doesn't work out, right? I got a graduate degree and I was teaching at the flagship university of the state, and still as an instructor in the department, teaching the classes that were earning the money for the department, I never made more than 35K a year. So it
Yeah.
became, there was no real strong incentive to keep that job, right? So it's interesting that people don't understand that your level of education education is one rung on the ladder, but without jobs that provide a livable wage, a secure retirement, and access to healthcare, I'm sorry, education is not going to get you to the middle class or the upper income brackets.
Can I just add one more thing?
Right.
Because I think it's really important regarding No Child Left Behind.
Yeah.
Prior to 2001, if you had enough credits, you secured enough credits, that was qualifications enough for you to graduate and receive your diploma from the state, right? Because it's a state document, your diploma is. No Child Left Behind put something there where you have to pass an exit exam in order to graduate. So it's not only your credits, it's a test that you have to pass in order to graduate. Every state that implemented these exit exams saw their graduation rates drop and their graduation rates drop and their dropout rates increase. Anecdotal, I had a senior who was about to graduate, and that year she earned an honor roll. She could not pass the test. So she had enough credits. She was on the honor roll, but because she could not pass the standardized test, she had to come back and repeat that next year simply to take the test. Now, how many people are going to come back to school the next year having all the credits, take a full course load simply to take a test? In every state where exit exams were initiated, the graduation rates dropped and dropout rates increased. And again, that's not an accident.
And then they use that data to say that's why we need to privatize the schools, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the other thing I think that we were talking about statistics earlier and what statistics do. If you start looking at the different states and how they put up their testing systems, everything we know is if you try to compare cohort to cohort, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Is because it's the flaws that are there. You don't know what was in the first group and what experiences they have to compare it to a second group, and the experiences they have, they're just not comparable. So when you say, oh, we'll compare these groups, and if this group does better than that group, it's not the same thing. It's not taking the oil. And the other thing is we were very used to percentages when we tested. If you took Iowa, your scores came back in percentages, whereas the new testing is supposed to be based on standards, which means, did you meet the standard? What do you know, and are you able to do based on a standard? Now that's a whole different kind of test from those percentages that we had, because they were more sort of like just all over the place, as opposed to the standards tests were supposed to be based on the standards for your particular state.
And so then you'd have no true comparison across states.
No, and that was the reason they came up with the national, what do we call it? The NAEP, which is given in 4th and 8th grade. And supposedly that's how we were going to compare, was based on those 4th and 8th grade scores.
So if I can lift up a couple of points specific to Louisiana and being passionate about what former President George Bush labeled as the soft bigotry of low expectations. And again, going to the point that we made at the very beginning, he hiding behind a mask of fighting for equity in education and saying, well, you just don't expect enough. You have to raise the bar. You changing it?
Go ahead. I want to complicate this conversation a little bit, just because I want to acknowledge my grandparents. My grandmother had an 8th grade education. My grandfather had a 5th grade education. He was only able to attend school part-time because he was expected to work part of the year. And at 14, he was expected to drop out and work. And And so he was only able to get to the 5th grade before he was 14 years old. You know, this notion somehow though, that there was always this like, poor people have always struggled to get an education, right? And I just think that it's interesting after we had that segregation of the urban areas due to the banking, you know, you can get to that later, but then they could start focusing and racializing the way in which, oh, it's low expectations, or there's this difficulty in getting an education. It's class, right? I mean, a lot of it is class and income bracket.
And so then, and looking at the time, it's 7:20.
Sorry.
Maria, you were about to say something? Oh,
Yes, I definitely want to touch on a point about how New Orleans had got taken over because of this skewed sense of policy that was put in place that was really unconstitutional in 2005 because they utilized state policy to implement it in only one parish. And what happened, it was an act called Act 35 in New Orleans in November of 2005. I believe they passed this policy in the state legislature. Everybody was looking at New Orleans in the state of emergency. And when they passed this policy in place, it actually established or fortified the recovery school district to really implement itself. And the recovery school district is the state takeover school district. And what happened is they had over 120 schools in New Orleans that was operating before Hurricane Katrina. According to the original filling school score, it was a 64.5. So I believe about 6 of those schools had that score. What they did is increase it to an 87. You took a 64.5, increased it to an 87 of a filling score. And by doing that, you closed over 103 schools. That's what happened. Like over 103 schools got taken over by the recovery school district. And they deemed that school district to be failing. And what happened is they demonized the elected school board. They had a lot of issues with a lot of turnovers and lack of stability in that sense. But for them to say this is all of Orleans Parish School Board's fault, you actually created a narrative in a way to bring in decentralization, which feeds privatization, because that's what they want. They want disparate independent school boards that are not elected to have control of tax dollars. That's essentially how this goes. And by doing so, they actually, it is just amazing to me how they targeted not only one of the largest school districts and largest parishes in the state, but also one of the blackest and biggest parishes, school district wise. And also they obstructed the labor union. I mean, they really gutted the Black middle class. So it's really hard, you know, for people in the South, especially in Louisiana, to not strip away class, but also include race as well, because it's intertwined together. They work hand in hand every time.
yes. And then Maria, go ahead and touch on how much the decentralization costs New Orleans. A while back, you blew my mind. A couple of years ago, you mentioned at a panel how much transportation went up, cost of nutrition went up, et cetera, but less students that are in the current New Orleans system. And then the return on investment, what was the return on investment? Are they doing phenomenal?
Yeah, so what I can speak to that on is they started out with spending about $18 million a year on school transportation before 2005. Now they're spending upwards of $41 million a year. That number could be higher now with all of the disparate contracts to drive yellow school buses. And remember, I said New Orleans had over 120 schools before Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Now they have about 82 schools with 38 independent school boards. And what you've seen was a full obstruction of democracy. And New Orleans was already, let's be real, they were already plagued with systemic poverty and racism before Hurricane Katrina. This exacerbated it. And what we had were, I was 17 at the time when Hurricane Katrina happened. So I had friends of mine who, were impacted on the early on part. Either they just graduated from high school that year, or they finished in 2008, 2009, where they got the early parts of the changes, but now they have children that are going through this school system. This has gone on for about 15 years. Over $5 billion of federal money is not fully accounted for. It's a lot of this background with the breaking down of funding and how it's been, who it went to. Dr. Renard Sanders did a great job in doing it in his book, along with a few other authors, with New Orleans Public Schools, The New Jim Crow. I suggest people read that book, because that was how they definitely benefit off of the pain of Black and brown people in New Orleans, and in turn that pain and disaster into profit for many people who benefited. Now we have about 50% of the schools that are operating are DNF schools. They are predominantly African-American populated with students. They serve over 47,000 children. And I believe 6,000 of them are white. They're in all the A and B schools. So it's very stark when you look at the statistics. It's heartbreaking even.
Maria, why don't you-
Dawn,
Yes.
the only reason EBR didn't get taken over before was because John White had to try to demonstrate that the charter schools in New Orleans were doing well, and he couldn't manipulate our accountability score system to do that and simultaneously make EBR fail. And that's the only reason we've survived as long as we have. And of course, as you know, the proliferation of charter schools at this point in EBR is just beginning to spiral. So
Very much so. And how he did that was he shifted the raw scale score to compute the school performance score. First, it was 0 to 150. He increased it from 0 to 200 for a few years, and then brought it back to 0 to 150. I'm sorry, but you cannot fully compare, in the fullest extent of your progression if you're comparing schools that are computed off of two different raw scale scores. So it was very skewed.
And so Tania and Maria, you all, Tania as a parent with your own personal experience with test out provisions, like what happens, and Maria with your experience as an organizer, organizing parents in education, y'all touch on for me how Louisiana decided to do the test out provisions, and how it pit parents and teachers against each other. Tanya, you had shared a while back your own personal experience about how you wanted to opt out because you see the game, but
so I would never opt my kids out. I always said that if I wanted to opt my kids out, I needed to move to Ascension Parish and start an opt-out movement, and that would be the only way we could get rid of the accountability system, right? But in East Baton Rouge Parish, well, I know we've got 2 minutes left, and it's hard to provide the sufficient context. My kids have continued to take the test. I've always been committed to my children going to public schools, even when I saw the way in which the testing was getting pernicious, right? And also the way it was damaging the curriculum. And I could see it at early stages. I try to weigh that though. I knew I wasn't going to opt my kids out because I knew, as y'all have pointed out, that those standardized test scores, my kids coming from their parents' education background and their income bracket, that they would be good scores, and my schools needed those good scores, right? At the same time, I didn't want to, harm my children. So it was a kind of if it looked like they were getting stressed out, do you want to do this? Are you okay doing this? And they would do it. And so that's how I navigated it, It's interesting also to watch them. My kids do test well, and trying to, on the one hand, praise them for doing well, but also putting into context, that doesn't really mean a whole lot, right? It's interesting to try to navigate that. But they even see when they get their test reports, it's meaningless. It is meaningless. Very often they'll have that they didn't get that top, whatever, in the section that they don't get is it mastery or advanced? I can't even remember. The testing their feedback won't even tell them what they need to do better, because they're strong in every category. Everything's strong, even if they're
miraculously, so Baton Rouge High still gets let me not call a school name, an A school, because I don't want to demonize Baton Rouge Magnet High. It's a good school. An A school in the current accountability system with that new additional growth score gets an A. That's the way they calculate it. You might
That's
say,
That's because initially, then they realized, the magnets all realized that with the growth score, they were set up where they could never get that growth score. They were going to end up failing because there's no growth when you're at the top.
just
So-
give them an A, and then compare them to the school down the street with children who are 2 grades behind, and they got moved up 1 letter grade, but they still, as a whole, 1 letter grade behind, and so they're an F. They're an F.
Right.
Okay. So
It's bogus.
let's give ourselves 5 minutes to close it out. I want to make sure that we mention some key things about Race to the Top. With No Child Left Behind, we saw that the call for standardization evolved into the accountability system. There are problems with the test being used. There are problems with the test being used to assess the academic ability. Tests are historically and currently created to be biased. Opting out of testing pits teachers and families against each other. Urban schools and students saw their curriculums continue to be drastically reduced in attempts to chase test scores. Race to the Top. And you see my Obama sign. I was a paid campaign staffer, love him to death, and don't regret helping him get in the seat. But when it comes to his education policy, I thought it was egregious. And so Race to the Top Obama brought with him to DC the same educational framework that existed in Chicago under then Chicago CEO, school CEO Arne Duncan, and essentially Race to the Top was the national version of Chicago's Renaissance 2010, which resulted in massive neighborhood public school closures and rapid charter expansion in Louisiana. Again, because we know that every child can learn, and every child can learn, but you also have to, it's like they want to use reality against you to say where you, that soft bigotry of low expectations. And so then in Louisiana, we're so passionate about pushing back against the soft bigotry of low expectations that not only did we implement testing in all letter grades starting in 3rd grade, and talking about implementing testing in kindergarten through 2nd grade. We'll talk about that on another roundtable. We implemented high stakes testing in addition to the exit exam. Then in 4th grade, we had tested children in 8th grade and held them back. It proved not to work in producing results, so we got rid of that high stakes component. But the fact that that a state like Louisiana is in the bottom 49, 50, like we toggle for 51st place between DC and Mississippi, but and have done so for decades. But when we decide we want to do high stakes testing, after knowing we historically don't educate our population as well as we should, we put the burden on their backs that they don't pass in the 4th grade, they don't pass in the 8th grade. And let's not forget that we have everybody taking the test. So if we have a huge immigrant population, which we do, and those babies just got here this school year, guess who's taking the best? Guess who is taking the test without a translator, without any assistance, and can't even read the test? Same problem with certain special education populations. And those scores are included in the school score with no compensation. First and foremost, why are we doing that to students in the first place? Why are we having a child take a test without a translator or taking a test in their own language? It's disgusting. It proves nothing except what you wanted to prove. Obviously, they wanted to show that a school is failing. And so in Louisiana, we've taken those types of steps with an already egregious problem. Did anybody want to go ahead and comment on Race to the Top? We basically touched on everything. Last thing, I do need to make sure I mention with the Race to the Top. Right now in Louisiana, everybody has to take the ACT. Why? My uncles made good money being some of the first Black welders in the state of Louisiana working offshore.
Dawn,
Yes, ma'am.
get the fact that 17 or below is a 0 for the school. And
Yes.
and what's the average grade for low income? I think African Americans average typically was a 17, and so they made the cutoff 18, and then you give those schools a 0 for anybody who doesn't make an 18 on the ACT. It was clearly designed to target urban school districts, majority African American schools and school systems, in order to set them up for fail. And that's 25% of the accountability score, if it's the same as it was when we did the research. I'm sorry.
We keep changing it. And Gretchen, did you mention that ACT was also an ETS?
No, ACT is given by the American College Testing Service.
Okay, thank you.
And it was used more for admission to state schools. But
Okay.
but it became like we were talking about the exit exams. So they were trying to put in place something that could grade schools, especially high schools, but it doesn't make any sense to use the ACT to grade a high school. I mean, it's just stupid. There's not a correlation between curriculum and, the test itself. It's just stupid.
So then, as we close out, and we got I knew we would get very passionate. You think you can discuss all of this in an hour and 30 minutes, but it's really hard because we want to make sure that we share different details that are important. Keith, Keith and Maria, you want to say something?
Now, about Race to the Top, you touched on it. It was a disaster, but again, it was crafted to target urban schools for closure or takeover. And as Maria referenced, which I didn't really get a chance to talk about, I think we'll talk about it maybe the second session, is that what it's done to particularly Black educators that have been in this profession for a long, long time, is that they targeted specifically schools Black educators are most likely to teach at, which are urban districts, foreclosure and takeover. So you had a massive jettisoning of Black educators, and in their space, a lot of younger white college grads with no experience and very little connection to the community. And it happened, very, very clearly and blatantly in New Orleans, but it's happening all across the country. It's happening in Camden, New Jersey, where I work and live. It's happening in Philly, Chicago, New York, any urban areas where you're seeing the Race to the Top roll out with vigor. Unfortunately, you're seeing the exact same thing. And which we'll get to, I think we'll get to in a second, or in subsequent sessions. At the same time, as you're hearing people talk about, we need more Black educators in the profession. Well, guess what? Y'all started the problem.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, just think about this and because we don't pay folks to teach like we should pay them, folks of color can have more opportunities by getting better pay and better benefits by going outside of education. Just like for women for a long time, you were going to be a teacher or a nurse. You didn't have an opportunity to go be a doctor, lawyer, whatever. The same thing, trying to find your way, in a lot of the Black high schools when they were that way, a lot of those folks had their doctorate degrees. These were highly, highly educated folks who were teaching in those high schools. They were academically unbelievably good schools, because that's where they could find a career that they might not have gotten, another place. So
if you had one more thought.
just this whole race to the top kind of thing. That out of that came a bunch of the whole evaluation systems, which contribute to like the loss of folks being in the classroom because they were just stupid. Excuse me, I think I've used that word more than once tonight.
Well,
I have some folks I really respect who help to turn some schools around say that we shouldn't be looking at what the teacher's doing. We should be looking at how the child's engaged and what work we're expecting of the child. Is the child engaged? Is the child thinking about this particular thing? That's where the work should be and not on the teacher themselves. And the other thing I would say is that before a child can learn, is they've got to perceive themselves as someone who can learn. And we have to address the attitude that they are welcomed in the school or the classroom or wherever it is that they're going to be educated. Do they feel at home there? Do they feel that somebody cares about them? If they don't, then they must just write off the whole thing and go away. So
then, let me catch. It was a question, and there was a question and a couple of comments I want to raise up. Megan mentioned, she asked, is there any data anywhere showing a connection between test scores and adult happiness? Presuming happiness is connected to one's ability to provide for oneself and family. She said she was showing her bias. She believed test taking is an industry all about money. As a student, as a teacher, and as a parent, standardized tests have not brought positives to my life. I feel you, Megan, because there's a lot of stress myself as a parent, making sure I properly prepare my children for tests when we could have been having some spending more quality time on better things. And I'm sure a lot of parents feel the same way. The test never helped me be a better teacher. Being able to spend time connecting with my students did. Amen to that, sister. And then Ted Fernberg said, I hope part 2 includes a discussion on ALEC and their influence on state laws that push privatization. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We will make sure we make it happen. Yes, sir. And then real quickly, Jared James Bro on Facebook mentioned a correction. He lifted up that we said graduate exit exams started with No Child Left Behind, but in Louisiana, it started in 1989. We don't want to be misleading. And so he mentioned that. I'm just putting it out there. It's all part of the same movement. It's all the same movement. Sometimes a timeline will happen faster in one place than across the nation, etc.
Yeah.
James for pointing that out, because I don't want folks to go around saying I'm misleading folks.
And the thing about it is that whole thing about how we were doing graduation rates. Every state had sort of a different way of looking at it. And were we looking at the cohort groups that if I entered the 9th grade, did anybody know what happened to me? That's sort of how graduation exit exams came into being, is they were trying to maybe find a common denominator for graduation rates.
And then miraculously, once they did, at the same time, certain things were put in place that decreased graduation rates. All right, so let me mention, and I'll let Brother Keith give us the final word. I want to first say thank you to each one of my panelists. Y'all are amazing. I uber respect all of y'all. This is, and I especially appreciate you all joining me on this special edition, because this means so much to me. Public ed means so much to me. It's my personal firm belief that some things are private good and some things are public good. And I got my master's in public education and not in business administration, because it's about service to people. Business is about businesses making profit, which is fine. That's what it should be. But Nothing wrong with folks making money. But when you put the money motive into a public good, then that's a whole nother animal. And then to try and put equity in the same equation, again, it's no coincidence. And I'll leave you with this stat. I want to show you real briefly. I want to share my screen and show you how coincidentally the prison population exploded during whose administration? During the Ronald Reagan administration. When Reagan took office in 1980, the total prison population was 329. And when he left office 8 years later, the prison population had essentially doubled. Now, let me help you visualize the significance of what I just said. This is a chart of the prison system growth from 1950 to 2016. I dare you to say it's a coincidence, even though I was sarcastic and put on the handout, incidentally, this happened. But I dare you to say for real that it's a coincidence that at the same time Nation at Risk came out, that well into Ronald Reagan years and beyond, prison rates more than doubled. They quadrupled, and every other druple you can come up with. And I think that speaks volumes, especially as we hear the same people lift up the statistic that they are making, lift up the fact that they are making prison beds if you're not reading on grade level by grade 3. Okay, so we using equity as a guise and a fight for equity as a guise. Simultaneously, we put more people in prison. And my last thought before I turn it over to Brother Keith, real briefly, is that look at the NAEP scores, the NAEP scores across the board. There's no statistical significant increase. There's no statistically significant increase. Our academic gains are flat. So we've been doing this garbage since 1983, destroying communities with school closures, busting up teachers' unions, causing people to lose jobs or just get disenchanted with the teaching profession altogether. And we literally have not improved our education system. So when they say the New Orleans miracle, the reformers like to call New Orleans a miracle because they got so much done. They got so much policy stuff done. They got so much privatization done. As a whole, this stuff does not improve academics. And Brother Keith, I'm gonna let you close us out.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself.
You're on the spot.
No, I really think I thank you this panel for being on, and I've learned some things from everybody's comments, so I appreciate that. So that's always something I welcome. But I really think it's really important when we see things that are really problematic taking place in terms of education right now. It's really important to at least know how we got here. And I feel like over the course of this last hour and 45 minutes, we spent a lot of time being able for all our viewers to understand exactly why we are where we're at right now. And it can help us sort of contextualize what it is we're seeing and sort of how to move forward. And so we're at the very worst, where we should keep our eyes out on, tomorrow, because the ramifications of it aren't going away anytime soon. So thank you guys for everything, and thank you for sharing. Thank you for teaching me. For sure, absolutely. Thank y'all, and I'll be reaching out on.
Thanks, everybody.
For part 2. I got some other people I want to bring on for part 2 as well. And so I'm gonna touch base with each of y'all to see if you feel like you could drop a little knowledge on part 2 or part 3. Okay.
So the other thing I was going to say, Don, look at those numbers you just posted and say.
You want me to put it back up for you?
Nancy Reagan and the war on drugs. Look from 1984. And the increase of the population. And who were the people that we were putting in jail? You're talking about a racist thing.
Yes, no coincidence. No coincidence. And with that, I'll leave that up as folks log off. Same bat channel, same time, July 22nd. we will do part 2. Who is in charge of the current narrative? Part two.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.